Welcome back, everyone. We are here day 3 in New York, semi-quarantine. As you may have heard, the Army is now in New York. I'll be giving a quick update on that. We'll be going over the news today on our continued broadcast on the coronavirus, the CCP virus as we're calling it. The U.S. Army has a statement on its website, and they're talking about what they're doing specifically in New York. Now it says the U.S. Army provides medical facilities to support COVID-19 efforts. COVID-19 being the virus or the disease of this virus. It says as more people are exposed to COVID-19, the U.S. Army is preparing to provide medical support and hospital capacity to help states and other national agencies to contain the virus and protect the nation. Moving on the orders of the Secretary of the Army, Ryan McCarthy, the Army recently issued deployment orders to the 531st Hospital from Fort Campbell, Kentucky, the 627th Hospital from Fort Carson, Colorado, and the 9th Hospital from Fort Hood, Texas, to deploy to New York and Washington State. So to make sense of this just real quick, this is not the National Guard. This is the U.S. Army, and they're specifically sending military-trained hospital staff to come into New York and Washington to set up temporary hospitals. Quite helpful if you understand the situation in New York, which is basically the hospitals were already overloaded. I mean, even before the virus, if you had to go to the emergency room, you were waiting for many, many hours. And so this virus outbreak, basically, the hospitals have been overwhelmed. They haven't been able to take care of everybody. You have lines going out the doors in some places, and so this was much needed. I have not yet personally seen the Army in New York. Allegedly, they're setting up these temporary hospitals in hotels and stadiums. The stadium's not too far from where I'm at, so maybe I'll go scope it out. Now, in Seattle, there is a WeChat group, which is, of course, this Chinese social media platform, where a woman is selling a pile of medical supplies. And people noticed that these supplies were materials sent by 2 U.S. commissions to China. This woman is selling Chinese or U.S. relief to China. When people questioned her about it because they were Chinese, she threatened to report them to immigration authorities. In Malaysia, local Chinese Communist Party media is claiming it donated materials to China. In other words, the Chinese Communist Party is claiming that it donated all these medical supplies to Malaysia. Local Malaysian officials clarified, you didn't donate anything, you sold it to us. We bought it from you. You didn't donate anything. And the Chinese Communist Party is doing the same thing in Italy, where they're saying, oh, we donated all these materials to Italy. People in Italy came out and said, you didn't donate anything to us, you sold it to us. Meanwhile, in Wuhan, people are afraid. I'll get more into what's happening in Wuhan. Basically, they're planning on reopening the city around in early April. They're worried that life will be harder if they face wave 2 of this, because already they're in economic shambles. People have been out of work. They haven't been able to leave their homes. In addition to that, they still have to pay rent. The Chinese Communist Party is now saying people who left their homes and got infected, which they could say is anybody, still has to pay all their own medical bills. And so not only have people been totally out of work, but they're very badly in debt now as well. And so Wuhan is not doing so hot. A Chinese doctor told the Epoch Times that 100 people were these were doctors, 100 doctors were diagnosed in one hospital. Doctors at these hospitals have not been allowed to report numbers of cases. In other words, if you've been following this broadcast, we've been talking about what's really happening in China. We've been, Epoch Times, we've been making a lot of phone calls into China. We've been talking to doctors, talking to hospitals, or hospital workers. The Chinese Communist Party is claiming this virus is over in China, and that is an absolute lie. The situation in China is still very bad. Hospitals are still full, and as this doctor told us, more than 100 hospital workers themselves have fallen ill to this virus just in one hospital. Here's what happened with China claiming that this whole thing's over. Basically, the Chinese Communist Party was facing economic collapse because all of its businesses, all of its factories were shut down. People were in quarantine in every city. They estimated that close to 1/3 of China's businesses would be out of business had that continued maybe another couple weeks. And a few weeks after that, another 1/3 of China's businesses would be out of business. And so they were facing economic collapse. Xi Jinping then came out and said, we need to get people back to work, we need to put the economy first. Suddenly, all the Chinese state-run media said, well, the virus is over, time to go back to work. And the funny thing is the Chinese Communist Party still delayed its party conference, which they hold once a year. It's like the main conference of the Chinese Communist Party. And so, safe for everybody to go back to work, but the Chinese Communist Party officials don't think it's safe enough to get together and meet. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense, right? The Chinese Communist Party is reporting 1,000 government officials in the financial system got the virus, and 47 of them died. Keep in mind, one, this is the Chinese Communist Party, and so if they say 1,000 people got it and 47 died, the number's probably a whole lot higher. This is notably only in the financial government system. They didn't report other departments like the education system or whatever. They've only given numbers now on the financial system. And so, in other words, what this means, meanwhile, the head of Morocco, the leader in Morocco, is the first national leader to be infected with the virus. The Chinese Communist Party is, of course, also still launching its propaganda campaign, although they're switching it up a bit. I'll get into that. They're using the pandemic right now to challenge the United States as kind of I wouldn't say global leader, but as in terms of systems. Now, this goes into a bit of background I need to explain. For the Chinese Communist Party, the main battle in the world is between the China model and the U.S. model. This is the Chinese Communist Party's model of governance, which is totalitarian communism mixed with a tiny bit of free market capitalism. It's a very bizarre system, not too bizarre if you understand the history of communism. Lenin, in fact, talked about the state capitalist monopoly as being the socialist system. In fact, shortly after the Soviets took over, he wrote a paper that said, how can we advance to communism if we fear the stage of socialism? And he described socialism as the state capitalist monopoly. In other words, it's the state seizes control of all the economic sectors, all the means of production, the factories stay open. That's what socialism is. It doesn't get rid of the factories, it doesn't get rid of the capitalist systems, it just denies the ownership of those systems from the average citizen. The government controls them. In China, you're allowed to have a basic level of trade up into a certain point, and as soon as you hit that point, well, the Chinese Communist Party is going to send a liaison to your business. They're going to take it over to some extent. As you get bigger, they'll take it over more so. And eventually all of your employees also have to become Communist Party members. They have a very much that state capitalist socialist model. So for the Chinese Communist Party, this totalitarian system, the China model, one that not only uses this socialist, they call it socialism with Chinese characteristics, not only uses that, but also has all these high-tech social controls, and one that also does not respect human rights. As we know, of course, during the Soviet Union, they had gulags, they had all these things. The Chinese Communist Party still has all that. They're still throwing people in concentration camps, it's like the Muslim Uyghurs. They still have re-education through labor camps. They still are using religious, religious groups as living sources of organ transplants, like Falun Gong practitioners and Uyghurs. They're still tearing down churches. They have not changed one bit. That is the China model. The other model is the U.S. model, which is this, it has its flaws, sure, whatever, but does respect some base form of human rights in the world and tries to enforce that to some extent. It says if you abuse your citizens too much, if you do things too badly, we will sanction you, we will punish you, we will take you out of the world market, and you will be a third world country forever, unless you want to change your ways. China has created an alternate system where they still work with those countries, like North Korea, like Iran, countries that would have very likely collapsed economically were it not for their support. And so the Chinese Communist Party is using this pandemic as a way to promote the China model. They're saying totalitarianism allows us, and they're not afraid to call it that, they're saying totalitarianism allows us to more effectively and more efficiently mobilize government forces to take care of issues like this. And so, of course, they control every single industry. They can easily facilitate manufacturing. Ironically, the company manufacturing the face masks and things like that was an American company operating in China, but the Chinese Communist Party put orders to withhold outside shipments on that and nationalize this American company operating on their soil. Meanwhile, y'all might have seen this Chinese ministry spokesperson on Twitter arguing with U.S. government officials. Long story short, the Chinese Communist Party was for a good while promoting this narrative that the virus, yes, the virus spread in China, but they're saying it may not have originated in China or did not necessarily originate in China. That's how they started. Then they started moving closer to this narrative saying the U.S. brought the virus to China. Aha. And so this Chinese ministry state spokesperson was going on Twitter in the U.S. and basically just repeating this stuff nonstop. The Chinese Communist Party is now walking this back, probably because they got so much pushback, and the pushback is a lot more strong than what they have. The Chinese ambassador is changing the narrative and is now thanking the United States. The chief editor of Global Times, one of the main Chinese state-run media, is saying that, previously he was just criticizing the U.S. as well. Now he's saying that whoever criticizes the U.S.-China ties will be forever criticized. Chinese Communist Party ministry spokesperson is also changing the narrative. Now he's talking about the importance of U.S.-China relations. How sweet. These people are puppets. The Chinese Communist Party tells them to say something, they say it, It's just flapping heads, right? That's all they are. Actually, an interesting development in China, one that shows, I'd say, the general sentiment of a lot of people, especially in Wuhan. There was a woman who has been kind of live blogging daily in Wuhan. She kind of got pretty popular since the time of the outbreak. And in her last post, she says that the 50 Cent Army, which is this basically army of Chinese Communist Party internet trolls, they're saying the 50 Cent Army is the real virus. This shows a pattern. A lot of people in China, now when you grow up under a totalitarian system, when you've been taught, a lot of people are in China, that the Communist Party is your father, it's your big brother, it'll protect you. Everything comes from the party, everything comes from the government, you're in a totalitarian socialist system. It's very hard for people to see things outside the government. Everything is of the government, everything comes from the government is responsible for everything. And so it's interesting to see that when pandemics and issues like this happen, people also blame the government. And the Chinese people are not letting them off the hook for it. As you remember, basically, long story short, in early December, the news of the virus started to spread. Doctors were warning about it. The Chinese Communist Party silenced them. One of the doctors they arrested ended up getting the virus and later died. Had they done something earlier, had they not covered this up, had they not arrested people for even speaking about it, very likely people would not have been able to leave Wuhan like they did and then spread the virus across all of China and the world. It happened at the worst possible time, which was right ahead of the Chinese New Year, where there's about 3 billion travel arrangements in China. And also it happened in the worst possible place, which is Wuhan, which is the main transit hub of all of China. Had they allowed them to do something about it, to talk about it, very likely we would not be in the situation we're in now. And had the Chinese Communist Party shared information on real numbers of infections, real numbers of deaths, real information on what they were finding out about this virus early on, very likely the rest of the world would have been much better prepared than they are. There's fears going around, given that, so the journal Nature had a report saying that 60% of virus patients are asymptomatic. People still are spreading it without knowing it because they're doing this so quickly, while you're risking a second wave of infection as soon as you end the quarantine, as soon as you open things up. Now, if you've been following this program, you know that the virus never ended in the first place. People still have it. They were sent home from hospitals. Very likely they're going to reinfect a lot of people anyways. China is on the verge of a second wave right now. We know that people are being sent home from hospitals who have the virus. We know that people are not being treated. Of course, a lot of people who are in quarantine have not been diagnosed because the Chinese Communist Party won't diagnose you. Now, the Epoch Times also received an internal document from Wuhan, a leaked document, saying that those people who are infected for going out of their homes have to pay medical costs themselves. And so, in other words, in addition to having to pay their rent, they also have to pay their medical bills. And so people in Wuhan are not doing so hot. And of course, how's the Chinese Communist Party going to say, who left their home or not? Pretty much they can blame anybody who had the virus, saying, how did you get it if you were in your home? Meanwhile, Representative Banks in the U.S. introduced a bill asking the Chinese Communist Party to pay reparations for damages. And he's also calling on U.S. companies to hold the Chinese Communist Party accountable and sue them for losses. And there are other representatives calling for similar things, noting that even individuals like us who have had losses, financial losses because of this virus, should take note of how much they lost, and maybe afterwards we'll have a big class action against the Chinese Communist Party. Meanwhile, an Italian doctor is saying the Chinese Communist Party twisted his words. As I mentioned, so the Chinese Communist Party, one of its first narratives was trying to blame this virus on the United States. That didn't quite work, and so what did they do? They blamed Italy. They're calling it the Italian coronavirus in China. And so what they did was, there was a doctor in Italy who did an interview, and he said, oh, well, we were seeing cases that might have been like this as early as November. Some Chinese propaganda saw it and said, aha, how could it have been there in November if we were dealing with it in China and, at the same time? It must have originated in Italy. And now this doctor in Italy is coming out and saying, you guys totally misquoted me. You totally took my words out of context. That's not what I said. And on that note, too, just as a last note, then we'll jump into these questions. The Chinese Communist Party is now shifting its entire propaganda narrative. Now they're saying we need cooperation with the United States, and now they're calling for, just global cooperation and friendliness, because that's how they work. That said, let's move on to now the questions. So this is from Brenda Nelson. She says, Joshua, great video, thank you. I have a question for you. You mentioned the globalists. I would like to know if you think in part that with this pandemic going on, does it seem like the globalists are trying to take advantage of this chaos to rein in their new world order? Because in many cases it seems like basic rights are being stripped away from Americans little by little. I won't go too deep into this. Yes, Brenda, that is a concern. We saw the same thing happen in the UK after World War II, where basically, the war ended. Basically, the UK government had to implement all these nationalizing systems. They pretty much took over the whole country. Government ran everything. When the war ended, they kept a lot of those things in place. And so, in other words, you had an expansion of government power because of a crisis, and when the crisis ended, they just kept hold of all those powers. They did not let go of them. And this is a concern anytime we have a national crisis that allows any government to expand its power into the realm that is normally held by average citizens like us. At the same time, when it comes to the whole globalist system, I think the whole globalist system is not doing so hot right now. In the EU, they suddenly found out that when a crisis hits, the EU is not going to do a whole lot to help you. Italy's finding this out right now. And when it comes to the United Nations, with the WHO siding with China and all this, and just repeating their numbers and repeating all their propaganda, I think a lot of people lost faith in them. So we'll see how this affects things. It is important to watch and see which countries do not relinquish the additional powers that they get because of this crisis. Next question is from Donna Riddle. She says, I have learned so much about Chinese society and CCP control in this channel. Am I correct that the cell phone keeps track of everyone's location to control a social score? I would like to know more about just how much the CCP controls the population. It is frightening. Thank you, Joshua. Thank you, Donna. So I think we talked about the social score. You're talking about the social credit system. That is not necessarily just limited to cell phones, although it will track data on cell phones. The social credit system pulls from everything. It's a smart city program, quote unquote, in China that basically collects every single bit of data they have on you. This is CCTV networks like, this whole, what do they call it, the Skynet system of all the cameras in China. It could be information collected from the Great Firewall, which would monitor your internet traffic and things like that. It could be things that monitor your online purchases, your online chats, your social media activity, who you're friends with, who you associate with, what are their beliefs? Are they religious? Are they dissidents? Do they believe in democracy? All of these things are used to form a social credit score in China. And it gives you a citizen score, and that citizen score, if it's high, maybe you'll have, more rights like a normal citizen in a normal country. And if it's low, you'll be treated basically like, an oppressed citizen. You won't have any rights. You won't be able to use basic services and so on. And so the Chinese Communist Party uses this as kind of let's say, an artificial karma system, where your rights in society are determined by how closely you align with political correctness. Political correctness, this is 1967 Mao Zedong. The ideas around how, basically if you do what the government says, you are politically correct. If you oppose what the government says, you are politically incorrect, you can be punished, you can be killed, and so on. It's a government-run moral system. Whatever the government says is correct, and that can change day by day. Next question, JRG. Wow, you're a bad reporter. Just repeating NTD News. Thanks. Just to clarify this though, so NTD News and Epoch Times are both part of Epoch Media Group, and so our reporters, China reporters like myself, I also do. I'm the senior investigative reporter at Epoch Times. We of course talk to each other. And we of course share. We share notes. We share analysis, and so yes, a lot of the analysis and notes you'll see on our China channels will have a lot of the same basic information because we talk to each other. That said, though, all of us have our own unique analysis, and so what I offer, what people like Simone Gao on NTD offers, or Tiffany Meyer offers, is of course their own unique take on that information. Next question from William Slatterly. I've heard that the PLA military bases were closed prior to the emergence of the CCP virus upon the world stage. Any truth to that? I have not heard about that. In fact, the Chinese Communist Party did mobilize the military in a lot of places. The head of the bio-warfare operations actually took over that P4 lab in Wuhan. I have not heard of the PLA military bases shutting down. There were infections within the PLA. The Chinese Communist Party wouldn't shut down the military, basically. In the U.S., of course, police, military, they are sworn to uphold and protect the U.S. Constitution. In China, the PLA is sworn to protect the Chinese Communist Party. They are basically the armed wing of the Chinese Communist Party. If the U.S. military were sworn to protect the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, that's basically what it is. It's a party military. Next question is from Jeff Silverberg. He says, quote, well, just as I would say to the official numbers, prove your numbers. And how does that change the numbers we hear about in the U.S. and other countries? Jeff, actually I agree with you. I don't believe the numbers in the U.S. and other countries as well right now. Basically because they haven't had the test kits to actually test people. There were a lot of people probably not getting tested in the first place, or a lot of people just staying at home and soldiering this whole thing out. We don't know what the real numbers are. Of course, this is in response to the last video I did where I talk about some of the official numbers coming out around the world. Those were WHO numbers. I don't trust them personally, especially when it comes to China. I mentioned a few things on China in that video, including that there were 21 million fewer cell phone accounts. In China, you can't just get rid of your cell phone account. It's tied to your social security number. It's tied to your bank account. You can't just get rid of it. And so 21 million fewer suddenly just drop. That suggests that maybe people died, who knows. And of course in Iran as well, they're reporting fairly low numbers, but we're also seeing mass graves that are so big you can see them from space. And at the same time, when it comes to the rest of the world, we have no real way of knowing either. Again, because of lack of testing kits. And because people are probably not getting tested and diagnosed in the first place, a lot of them. When it comes to Italy, we're probably getting some of the most accurate numbers right now because that's really the first country to really face the real full brunt of this crisis. And it's also the first country that really doesn't have an interest in suppressing information. At least I assume. Next question, Shane O. Good talk. I'm curious if the CCP were to have deliberately released the virus from the P4 laboratory in Wuhan, what motive would they have in doing that? Wonder if you would get any thought on this. Shane, yeah, of course, I should emphasize we don't really know where the virus came from still. I actually have an investigative documentary I've been helping with coming out soon that does look into the origin. And the evidence does suggest it did possibly come from a lab, actually, if you really dig into it. And especially the type of research they were doing at that P4 laboratory. I mean, really, they were experimenting with the SARS virus, they were experimenting with bat coronaviruses, and they were splicing them. They had public reports on this. And so the most, let's say, reasonable assumption right off the bat would have been it would have came from that P4 laboratory, which was about 20 miles up the road from that seafood market. But of course your question is, what would the motivation be if it was intentional? Intention is going to be hard to prove. It could have been a vaccine research they were doing. One of the things they were doing at that laboratory was increasing the virality of diseases, which has actually been banned in the U.S. since 2014. And in fact, when the Obama administration banned that type of research, one of the programs that got banned was a joint research program between a North Carolina university and the P4 and the group in Wuhan that was operating the P4 lab. Now, when it comes to laboratories in China, and this is important to note, that now there are two rival factions in China, political factions. One is under Xi Jinping, the other is under Jiang Zemin. They do not like each other. Both of them are pretty dang bad. The Jiang Zemin faction even more so. They have been fighting for control over the country. You might have heard of Xi Jinping's anti-corruption campaign, where he's been going around arresting all these top-level Chinese Communist Party officials, actually even going down to pretty low levels now. Most of the people who were targeted under that were part of the Jiang faction. This was a big piece of the factional battle taking place. Xi Jinping does not control all of China. A lot of things are still under control of the Jiang faction. And basically, Jiang Zemin still controlled the country under Hu Jintao as well. The laboratories in China, the labs, are still under the control of the Jiang faction. Xi Jinping only very recently, I'd say, fully gained control of the Chinese military. The Jiang faction still controls the labs. If this were an intentional leak from the labs, just speculating, it would have been very likely something done by the Jiang faction. The head of the P4 laboratory is very close to Jiang Zemin's son. And so, if this were an intentional leak, it would be a factional thing. Which, if you understand the thinking of the Jiang faction, I would not put that beyond them. This was a very, very vulnerable time for the Xi faction. It was right ahead of the U.S.-China trade deal. It was right in the midst of this whole, all these pro-democracy and anti-Chinese Communist Party protests they had in Hong Kong. And it was right after the elections in Taiwan, which saw a landslide victory against the party that supported the Chinese Communist Party. And so landslide victory against the Chinese Communist Party, essentially. This was the weakest time for the Xi faction. It was also the worst possible time right ahead of the Chinese New Year, where people are going to travel. There's about 3 billion travel arrangements, again, as I mentioned. And also in the worst possible place, which is Wuhan, which is the main transit hub of all of China. Of course, we can't jump to conclusions, but take it for what you will. Next question, we just have two more. Next is from Jamie Ross. Great report. My question is, how many people who died had the normal flu shot prior, and how many did not have any? I know that might be impossible to answer, but I think it is a valid question. Jamie, of course, we have no possible way of knowing who got the flu shot before getting infected. You can check out, though, our interview we had with Dr. Schneider, Dr. Alexander Schneider. He is a vaccine scientist. I think some people saw the title of that video and assumed it was like an anti-vaccine video. It was not, although he was warning about a coronavirus vaccine. Dr. Schneider, he researches and makes vaccines. He is a vaccine doctor. He's not anti-vaccine. Now, one of the traits of a coronavirus, this is what he said, when you get a normal vaccine, your body creates antibodies. And so when your body creates these antibodies, those antibodies can go and kill the virus. That's basically your body develops antibodies that help with the immunity process. When it comes to coronaviruses, the coronaviruses can actually use antibodies, which is why it's so hard for them to create vaccines for coronaviruses. And so who knows, maybe a vaccine is not the good thing to fight this virus. It doesn't mean they can't make a vaccine, they just can't use the normal vaccine process for it. They have to come up with a new process for it. Next question is from Jack Moore. He says, the 50 Cent Army are the patrons of the YouTube channel China Uncensored. Do a little more homework, dude. And so, yes, I'm aware of China Uncensored, and I'm aware they call their Patreon supporters the 50 Cent Army. I'm actually friends with Chris Chappell. I've known him since he started China Uncensored. Yeah, so when Chris made the name the 50 Cent Army for his Patreon supporters, it was tongue-in-cheek, referring, kind of making fun of the Chinese Communist Party 50 Cent Army. I could put up a link to it in terms of what the 50 Cent Army is. But the 50 Cent Army is also the kind of army of internet trolls that the Chinese Communist Party employs to go and leave comments across the internet. If you go back and watch even his first videos where he announces his Patreon, he explains this, and he was joking about it, and he says, we're going to start our own 50 Cent Army, and so donate 50 cents to support me. I think that's important to mention, actually, because I noticed a few of you, or at least a couple of you, mentioned also that Chris Chappell has the 50 Cent Army. Yeah, so not to confuse things, there is a Chinese Communist Party 50 Cent Army, and yes, Chris Chappell of China Uncensored also has his tongue-in-cheek version of the 50 Cent Army, which are his Patreon supporters. Now, with that said, folks, please remember to like and subscribe. We really need your support. Also, click the notification bell if you're on YouTube, because you'll get alerts when our new videos are up. We're going to be doing this broadcast 5 days a week. We're still going to be doing interviews. I'll be getting some interesting guests on, China experts, scientists, doctors, and so on. We're going to be focusing pretty heavy on this virus as this whole thing plays out, because one, it is, I think, the biggest crossroad of the world right now, where it's unclear what the future is going to hold for us, and so I think there's a lot of uncertainty. And two, because, of course, my own background as senior investigative reporter at Epoch Times, and I've been researching Chinese Communist Party front operations since 2006. This falls very much in line with a lot of my own research, and so hopefully I can give some useful analysis during this time. That said, please tune in next time, and thanks again. See you then.